Thank you very much. I'm Ian Martin, journalist. I was introduced recently at an event as a distinguished journalist, which is actually a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing. But we are joined, hopefully, by the miracles of new technology from California by Professor Niall Ferguson. And we're going to have a conversation here. Yes, here he is popping up on the screen. Good to see you, Niall.
Hey, Ian.
We're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation from a global perspective to try and put some of these issues that you've been discussing today in context. We're going to have about 20 minutes of us conversing, and then I'm going to throw it open, and please feel free to ask any questions moderated through me. First thing is, Niall, you were on the other side of the referendum battle from me, but afterwards you did pretty much change sides. Why?
I think the technical term is recant. I recanted, I think back in November, having been on the Remain side. And I was a fairly half-hearted Remainer, it must be said. But to summarize briefly what my position was, I had been for a long time, you may remember this, a big critic of the European Union, and especially of monetary union, right through the 1990s. I was as much of a Euro basher as my old friend Andrew Roberts. Many of my friends ended up as Brexiteers, and I didn't. And the reason I didn't was partly, as I admitted last year, personal loyalty to David Cameron and George Osborne, whose government I didn't want to fall. But it was also, I think, a kind of Bismarckian view that we would be better off on the inside of this thing than on the outside of it for conservative reasons. I mean, my attitude towards European integration was like Bismarck's towards German unification. It was a bad thing in many ways, but it would be better to try and control it. And the reason that I ended up recanting last year was that in the end, that project of trying to influence the direction of the EU from the inside had failed. And you could see that it had failed in two dimensions. The catastrophic outcome of monetary union, which was just what those of us opposed to it had predicted, and then the migration crisis. And so I argued that in the end, Brexit was right because the EU had failed even from a cynical conservative vantage point.
We all here in London, of course, are prone to regarding Brexit as hugely significant. But where would you, as one of our leading historians, where would you put it or place it in terms of historical context? How significant an event is Brexit?
Well, I think it's a significant event. No way would I question that. But if you take a 200-year perspective, then I think it fits into a pattern which goes right back to the early 19th century, if not further. And that pattern is one of Britain's fundamental ambivalence about its continental commitment. I've been writing Henry Kissinger's biography for the last few years. Kissinger writes about this in his first and in many ways most brilliant book, A World Restored. Castlereagh can't deliver Britain after the Congress of Vienna as a permanent part of the concert of Europe because there's just too much pulling in the other direction at home. And so Britain's role in the 19th century becomes a sort of semi-detached part of the concert of Europe. Kissinger says Britain's the balancing power, but it's never wholly committed in the way that Metternich had hoped it would be. And I think that's really what we've lived through. Another of those periods when Britain appears to engage itself in the way that Castlereagh had wanted to do, and then pulls out in the way that Canning wanted it to do. That's really what happened. We joined in the 1970s, and we joined really under false pretenses. We made believe that this was a purely economic enterprise, whereas the Europeans had made it pretty clear from the days of Schuman and Monnet that it was supposed to lead in a political direction towards ultimately some kind of federal Europe. And I don't think Britain ever could be part of a federal Europe. Bundesrepublik Europa, to use Angela Merkel's terminology, is something we're just allergic to for very good historical reasons. And that, I think, is why it's been a short, brief interlude, really, our engagement with what became the European Union.
Why do you think since Brexit, and since Trump, the populist tide seems to have gone out a bit in Europe in terms of look at what's happening with Macron, look at what happened in the Netherlands. Incidentally, Macron, who I'm pretty sceptical about, has just done something rather extraordinary this afternoon in that he went to the Whirlpool factory in his own town and faced down the demonstrators who ended up shaking his hand, all these sort of angry workers furious about globalization. So there's something very interesting going on with Macron. Why have voters in Europe moved away from populism, do you think?
Well, I don't think they've moved away that dramatically. I think electoral systems are different on the continent from the Anglo-Saxon world, and that's part of the reason that populists are unlikely to come to power in countries like the Netherlands and France, not to mention Germany, where the alternative for Deutschland is pretty much nowhere at this point. I think there's been a reverse domino effect, though, Ian. I think that the continental Europeans looked at Brexit and then looked at Trump and said, we don't really want to be a part of that. And those floating voters that decide all elections in the developed world are now close, so they're decided by a relatively small number of people who are congenitally ambivalent. And I think those ambivalent voters who might possibly have toyed with the idea of a Wilders vote or a Le Pen vote if they'd been really angry enough, were kind of inoculated by the spectacle of Brexit and Trump, which, remember, play very badly in the European media. I mean, if you think The Guardian paints a pretty bleak picture, you should take a look at how the German press covers these things. So I think that's part of the reason. I mean, the other part of the reason is that we shouldn't exaggerate the power of this populist wave. It's not as if Trump's victory was a resounding victory. It was a hair's breadth, 35 or so thousand voters in 3 Midwestern states could have gone the other way and Hillary Clinton would be president. We wouldn't be having this kind of a conversation. Brexit wasn't exactly a massive landslide. So I think there's a sense in which what we're really seeing here is a kind of ambivalence rather than a full-scale reaction towards globalization. I'd like to put it this way, Ian. Globalization overshot. And even those of us who were in favor of it and benefited from it should acknowledge that after a certain point, there was too much migration. Trade became too unregulated and governed by trade agreements that were far from symmetrical. And free capital movement, which is another crucial part of globalization, also got out of hand. And the reason that people turned off globalization was not that they completely forgot about the benefits of cheap iPhones and flat-screen TVs, but they saw the financial crisis, and they saw the migration crisis, and they said, hang on, this has gone too far. And so what we're really seeing is a process of dialing back globalization to the point that, take Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, whom most people would regard as a fully paid-up globalist, but he's just been party to the introduction of differential taxes on foreign buyers of Chinese homes, of Canadian homes. So I think even in Canada, people recognize that globalization has gone too far if the housing stock of Vancouver can be owned by Chinese investors who never actually live there or hardly at all. We're all really caught up in this attempt to recalibrate and dial back globalization. And I think Macron, too, will have to do that if he's to be anything other than, as somebody put it rather nicely, François Hollande with a facelift.
And it's that problem from the root of this is surely the crisis at which that class that you describe had essentially given voters the impression that all of this economics, trade, regulation could be conducted at a level above the nation state. And then when the bill landed, the bill turned out to be addressed to national taxpayers, and they're still pretty furious about it. I wanted to ask you about Trump in that context, really. I'm someone who's pretty pessimistic about him other than on tax reform. But should those who are interested in free markets, open markets, free trade, to what extent should we be worried about the Trump protectionist agenda? He's obviously shifted quite a long way in 3 months and then seems to be shifting back again in the last few days. How would you characterize it?
Well, worry is always a good idea. I tend to worry all the time. Hysteria is the thing I try and avoid, and there's so much of that, especially in academic circles, that it's almost reached comic proportions. There were people talking about the impending dissolution of the Republic and the imposition of tyranny. That was all nonsense, and at least I got that right last year. That the problem, if anything, is the weakness of the executive branch under Donald Trump, his lack of experience. They can't even staff it. I don't know if that's an accident or a deliberate strategy to cause the so-called administrative state to collapse through simple lack of personnel. But it doesn't make for a strong presidency, and I don't think anybody should confuse a Twitter account with a strong presidency, no matter how many tweets there are. In fact, the more, probably, the worse.
Yes.
The real issue in domestic politics is what is going on in Congress. And by the standards of British politics, the striking thing is the lack of party discipline that the Republicans have. I think that's important because it's made it so hard for them to deliver on Paul Ryan's policy agenda. Healthcare was a train wreck. We're going to see the tax reform. Everybody's hoping for the best, fingers and toes are crossed. But I must say, I can't believe that they'll do a tax reform that's deficit neutral. So one has to worry about these operational problems that characterize the Trump administration. And one also has to worry about the fact that here's the first president of the United States since the 1930s who explicitly used the word protection in his inaugural address. We had grown very accustomed to a United States that was wholeheartedly committed to free trade. Donald Trump is not. It's about the only thing he's been consistent about. And I do think that makes for a much less benign climate for Brexit than many people who were arguing for it last year led voters to expect. I think the great weakness of the Brexit argument, as I saw it, and I still think this was a weakness, was to claim that there was this glad, confident morning that Britain could enter of free trade agreements that would be just way, way better than anything that we got under the EU dispensation. It's not that kind of a world when Donald Trump is the president and you have to rely on Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, to defend free trade at Davos. If there's one thing I would worry about from a British vantage point, it's that Trump is creating an atmosphere in which the international order, including, remember, the World Trade Organization, may be vulnerable to not a kind of descent into autarky, this is not the 1930s, but a shift into a mode of trade negotiations that are bilateral, in which hardball is the name of the game, and he's showing this right now with Canada. He's definitely playing hardball with the Chinese. I'm not convinced that Britain is going to be given some kind of privileged status in Trump's world order.
Well, we've heard a lot on this side of the Atlantic about the UK potentially being at the back of the queue or the front of the queue. I'd question whether there's a queue, an orderly queue at all. But you're suggesting there that the excitement over here when Trump hosted Theresa May, that we shouldn't read too much into that.
No, I don't think we should. And I think we should be watching very carefully how the Trump administration handles the trade negotiations that it's currently in. Remember, it's currently negotiating NAFTA, and it's doing this with a certain amount of slapping about of the junior partners, Mexico and Canada. And the other big issue at the moment is the US-China relationship. That's number one in terms of its international economic significance. And I think it's very interesting to see the way that Trump is playing that. From the vantage point of his critics, it's a risky strategy, given the importance of that Chinese-American or Chi-American relationship to the world economy. Actually, from the vantage point of Trump's defenders, and here I'll take his side, he's actually played this well so far, because Trump's great talent, and people don't generally recognize this, especially not academics and Europeans, he has a great sense of when the other party's weak. He's kind of got antennae that pick up weakness. And Trump, I think, rightly discerned, just as his rivals for the Republican nomination were all weak, so I think he now realizes that the rivals for international leadership are weak, especially the Chinese. So the Trump strategy is to kind of rough up the counterparty and take advantage of the counterparty's weakness. Canada and Mexico are really weak compared with the United States in a trade negotiation. Actually, just about everybody is weak. And the Chinese have already shown themselves ready to make quite significant concessions to the United States. So I think Britain needs to watch this carefully, because this is the new mode of operation where trade negotiations are, they're straight out of Thucydides, where the strong can do what they like and the weak must do what they will. And we must hope that we're not in that second category.
And what are the opportunities, do you think, from Brexit? What are you upbeat about?
Well, as I said, I'm a little sceptical that this is going to be a kind of new Elizabethan era where we take advantage of global opportunities, because I think the globalization boom is past. Actually, I think the opportunities may well lie elsewhere. They may be domestic. Number one, I think that we now, as we go through what will be a long and expensive divorce. In fact, I recently argued that it might be worse than a divorce, it might be a schism. As we go through that, I think we're going to be forced to do what divorcees always do, which is to realize that many of the things you blamed on your ex were in fact your own problems. And that the United Kingdom has spent, with the media playing a leading role, mentioning no newspapers, the Daily Mail, the United Kingdom has been blissfully blaming all its problems on Europe for too long. And the reality is that when you look at the economy, the productivity numbers are unimpressive. When you look at the innovation, we are not exactly, we're not exactly Israel, we're hardly a start-up nation. There's an awful lot, really, that we're now going to have to accept is wrong with us and not somehow the fault of Brussels. I think there'll be a healthy reality check as we find it actually a little harder than it said on the label to make Brexit an economic success. The second thing, which is, I think, really quite important, is that ultimately it is probably better for continental Europe that Britain is no longer in the EU or no longer will be in the EU. Because I think the whole project of the federal Europe could never be achieved with us half in and half out. And now we'll see if they can actually reform their institutions. And they won't be able to blame us. So there's a sense in which we'll now find out whether the vision of a united Europe, of a federal Europe, is realizable. I don't think it would be a bad thing for Britain if it were, though it would certainly be precisely that kind of German-dominated Europe that we worried about an awful lot 100 years ago. But I think at least with this clarification of the relationship, both sides now can see whether they can walk the walk. We've all talked the talk for so long, I can't really remember a time when we weren't blaming them and they weren't blaming us. And now we'll find out really whether we can deliver all the things that the anti-Europeans have extolled for so long, and we can find out whether they can deliver a united Europe.
Yeah, now we're going to move to taking some questions, and just while I wait for some hands to go up, you mentioned there, Niall, very interesting insight there that Britain has taken to blaming other people. It's just we're just really fortunate that we have such a fantastic general election campaign and two parties battling it out on these great questions, economic reform and public services. He said sarcastically. But the first question, who do we have? Matt Ridley here.
Niall, I don't know whether you can see me, but I can certainly see you.
I can see you.
I'm very struck when I visit the United States by how negatively Brexit has been portrayed through the media in the United States, and in particular as a retreat, as a turning inwards. Is there any chance of turning that round, or have the CNN and FT or whoever's done this made it too difficult to see it? It's, in other words, that it's quite different from the Trump agenda. That distinction is almost impossible to get across to my American friends.
I think what happened, Matt, was that Trump endorsed Brexit, and so Brexit became contaminated in the eyes of the mainstream media in the United States as the British equivalent of Trumpism. One can't really overstate the extent of the hostility of organs like the New York Times and the Washington Post or CNN to Trump. They are hell-bent on his failure. And I think the reason that Brexit has been portrayed negatively is simply because it's in the slipstream of Trump. And I've read relatively little coverage, even in more sympathetic organs like the Wall Street Journal, that has correctly characterized what Brexit represents. So I think you're right to spot that. The good news is that low expectations are not always the worst place to start. And I think if we had Americans running around saying everything is awesome, you know exactly what the next chapter of the coverage would be. It would be massive disappointment, epic fail. The great thing about starting with low expectations, and this is true of the Trump presidency, by the way, is that relatively modern
I think we're losing him there. Is he back,
success
Neil?
will look like crushing triumph. And I'm looking forward to that because it will be fun watching old Trump's critics. Am I inaudible?
You're breaking up.
I can hear you, Ian. Am
You're
I
breaking up.
visible but
I'm just going to ask, Matt, the one thing I found on my last trip to the US, the one thing that worked was to explain it in the context of, and I don't want to run through the arguments of the referendum again, is to explain it in terms of self-government. And that seems to actually sort of grab people when you explain what the ECJ is. And precisely, yes, that's at least gives us a glimmer of hope. Do we have any more questions? And Neil is back in the room. Gentleman here.
I was struck by your argument that Trump is very good at smelling weakness. What is it that Theresa May can do to make Britain a strong negotiator in any future trade deal? It seems to me that North Korea seems to be having a go at trying to get to a position of having a stronger hand than it had a year ago. What could the UK do?
I don't think I've ever been asked what the UK can learn from North Korea. Can we keep this one in the room? Because I'd strongly argue against nuclear tests or missile launches as
not a good
part
idea.
of our strategy, which does seem to be the North Korean way.
Yes. I had one question, Neil, about financial innovation. As you know, the city, history of the city, an obsession of mine, you're a great historian of money. Is it possible that in all of this fuss about passporting, and of course London is the capital of the Eurozone, that there's something more interesting happening in that the very nature of money is about to change, and the idea of a fixed EU/ECB giant regulatory bloc that we've sort of grown up with since the mid-80s, that in itself might come open to challenge, and that's surely a great opportunity for London, a place that's always innovated in terms of finance.
Yes, it's very hard to kill a financial centre, and the French who are plotting this will, I think, be disappointed at how resilient London proved. People have tried to kill London as a financial centre before, indeed by bombing it from the air, and London recovered from the 1940s. It took a while. Look at Hong Kong, which is under intense pressure from the regime in Beijing. But they can't really kill it because it's too much a golden goose. That's, for example, what they're using to try and attract more investment into the Chinese corporate bond market from abroad. It's through Hong Kong. So I think one of Britain's greatest strengths, it may be its greatest strength, is the vitality of London as an international financial centre. And those who proclaimed its impending demise as a result of Brexit were clearly wildly exaggerating. There certainly will be some job losses, but that doesn't mean there won't be some job creation as well. This is an amazing time, Ian. You're right to ask this question because we're on the brink of a shift in the nature of money itself. It won't necessarily be Bitcoin, but blockchain-based transaction systems are coming, and when they come, they're going to radically alter the entire system of payments and indeed banking itself. I'm sitting speaking to you from very close to Silicon Valley on the Stanford campus, fintech means a transformation of the international financial system. If London can be part of that, then it will prosper regardless of what the Eurocrats try to do to penalise us in the course of this divorce.
So we've got time, I think, before these good people want to go to the pub after a hard day's debating. Time, I think, for one last question from this gentleman down here.
Roger Kendrick. It's been mooted that we will have a transitional agreement and that we will continue paying into the EU for the privilege. Could you explain why we would spend about 10 billion a year so they can export about 80 billion more to us than we do to them?
Well, now you're asking a question that in some ways is above my pay grade, because I'm not entirely sure how certain it is that some kind of transitional agreement will be arrived at. My sense is that Theresa May likes to keep her options open as a negotiator, and that the reason for the general election had to do with that, and that the reason that there's talk of a transitional agreement has to do with that. Of course, from the vantage point of a pure Brexiteer, it's a repellent thought. But I don't see that there would be any benefit to Britain's negotiating position in ruling it out now. So I would prefer to think of this in Kissingerian terms. And it's perhaps relevant here to note that Kissinger surprised me somewhat by being pro-Brexit when we discussed it last year. And the way that he put it was precisely that Brexit created strategic as well as economic options for Britain that hadn't existed under the status quo. So I think that this is not to be taken too literally as the likely end point of the negotiation, but rather as part of a range of options that she needs to keep open as the negotiations begin. Remember, Britain is at a fundamental disadvantage in these negotiations. We're not just outnumbered. The Lisbon Treaty is designed to make it disadvantageous to be the party leaving. And so it's actually a very, very difficult negotiation that lies ahead for Britain. It is the divorce with 27 ex-wives. And I think from that vantage point, the last thing that you should do in negotiation is pre-commit to an outcome that, in fact, from the vantage point of the European negotiators, might be quite a desirable one. So I think she's quite wise to keep her options open at the minute. And I think if Henry Kissinger were handling Brexit, he would do much the same.
Niall Ferguson, fascinating as always. Thank you very much from everyone here in London, and look forward to seeing you soon in the flesh. And I'm going to hand you back over, after please a round of applause for Professor Ferguson. Thank you.